Chapter 2. Ibn Sina's Cosmological Argument. Immanuel Kant classifies arguments for the existence of God into three categories, namely the cosmological, ontological, and teleological. In commenting on Kant's understanding of Anselmian and Leibnizian ontological arguments, Paul Guyer notes that, quote, Kant's rejection of it was based on the supposition that its proof is ideal rather than real, that is, that it only unpacks what we may have included in the concept of God, but cannot establish that there is any object answering to that concept. Kant criticizes the cosmological argument itself. Quote, why have we instead accused the cosmological idea of falling short or exceeding its end, namely possible experience? The reason was this: it is possible experience alone that can give our concepts reality. Without it, every concept is only an idea, without truth and reference to an object. End quote. For Kant, the reason why cosmological arguments are limited is the exact opposite reason of why ontological arguments are not. In other words, Kant viewed cosmological arguments as limited in that they are an attempt to prove the immaterial through the material. Kant also viewed ontological arguments, like those offered by Anselm and Leibniz, as limited for the exact opposite reason. An ontological argument is, quote, a proof which argues for the existence of God entirely from a priori premises and makes no use of any premises that derive from our observation of the world, end quote. Whereas a cosmological argument bases at least one of its premises on an observable cosmic phenomenon. The question of whether Ibn Sina's argument for the existence of God is ontological or cosmological, or indeed a synthesis of both, is an interesting one, as it allows us to investigate the Kantian presupposition that there exists a sharp binary between the physical and the metaphysical, a priori and a posteriori. To what extent is there a divide between the two, such that there is applicability to one format if propositions are made in the other? More crucially, does metaphysical existence amount to actual existence? What are the effects of these questions on argument made specifically in relation to God's existence? To what extent could Ibn Sina's arguments be seen as ontological and belonging solely in the realm of the metaphysical? The answers to these questions could change the discourse on this topic, especially in Western circles where medieval Enlightenment ontological proofs are most closely associated with Anselm, Leibniz, and Samuel. This essay will examine Ibn Sina's epistemology and its connection with its subsequent systematic theology. This will then be compared with other, more traditional forms of cosmological argumentation to highlight the continuities and the discontinuities between such arguments. Finally, the implications of this discussion on the philosophy of religion discourse will be mentioned, with some concluding remarks on the importance of such a study in the debate on positivism and idealism in philosophy. In order to understand what Ibn Sina tried to establish in his main argument, it is vital to understand his working epistemology. Such information is found in his book, Al-Shifa, The Cure, in the chapter on Al-Ilahiyat, metaphysics, that which relates to divinity. However, where students of Aristotelian philosophy will be familiar with this choice of book title, Ibn Sina differentiates his arguments from Aristotle's antecedent metaphysical argumentation. Ibn Sina candidly differentiates the physical world, or the world of Tabi'a, and the conceptual world, designating logical principles and mathematics as abstractions of the conceptual world. Ibn Sina states, quote, sensory experience, mahsusat, is premised on it, i.e. mathematical abstraction. Therefore, it, mathematics, precedes in essence sensory experience, end quote. Referring to logic, Ibn Sina argues, quote, looking at logic from an essence perspective, it is clear that it is out of the scope of the sensory experience, end quote. In fact, Ibn Sina lists many logical precepts, such as the law of non-contradiction, and vitally, the possible and the necessary, as products of mental conceptualizations. Almost immediately, as if his reader is waiting for him to do so, Ibn Sina then discusses the Aristotelian prime mover concept. Ibn Sina writes, quote, we need to find the first cause after initially conceptualizing its existence and not on account of it being the first mover, end quote. As students of Aristotle are aware, this is a crucial point of departure from Aristotelian and post-Aristotelian physics and metaphysics. Such theories depend on theories of motion, concluding that there must be an initial mover. According to Ibn Sina, the parallel of using conceptual knowledge to determine physical realities is similar to using mathematical knowledge for engineering. In this point, Ibn Sina stands out in stark contrast to his predecessors such as Al-Farabi. John McGuinness says that the metaphysics of Ibn Sina is the, quote, culmination and crowning achievement of his philosophical system, end quote. One can anticipate here, as will be discussed, that Ibn Sina also sees the need to do the same thing with his argument for God's existence, in a similar way to an architect conceptualizing geometric designs before putting these designs into action. Ibn Sina alludes to the fact that his methodology grants a definite and certain knowledge of God's existence. However, a few important points of consideration can be extrapolated. Firstly, Ibn Sina could be said to be a dualist insomuch as he accepts the existence of things other than the mental and rejects a materialistic or positivistic account for the existence of things. This is also because he believes that there is an intersectionality between the material tabi world of existence and the conceptual world of existence. While Ibn Sina seems to be aware that other philosophers may have different epistemological dispositions to him, he not only produces the aforementioned counter-argument to their positivistic claims, he also seemingly wants to produce an evidence acceptable to them. Moreover, a byproduct of Ibn Sina's reasoning is that a strict idealist, in a modern Berkeleyan sense, may not need to engage with Ibn Sina's cosmological argument in order to be satisfied that a necessary existent, one that all other contingent existence depend on, exists. Ibn Sina makes his argument for God's existence in three main works, Al-Shifa, which we have been discussing, Al-Najat, and Al-Ish'arat, and Al-Tanbihat, his shortest of all three. Ibn Sina preambles his discursive explication with an epistemological exposition of a similar complexion to the one we find in Al-Ilahiyat. He mentions emotions such as fear and anger as being non-sensory in the empirical sense, in a way that attempts to remind us of the binary nature of the conceptual world and physically existent things. Crucially, he makes specific mention of truth and says that, quote, every truth should be regarded in accordance with its essential reality, which with it, the subject in question is regarded as true, end quote. To illustrate this point, Ibn Sina provides the example of a triangle and says that, quote, its reality is connected to concepts of straightness and lines. They configure it, the triangle, by reasoning its three-sided nature as if it were its reason for being in a material sense, end quote. In using the triangle as an example, Ibn Sina interestingly mentions that its composite configuration, three-sidedness, could either be an inherent characteristic or something which requires a causative agency, quote, al-illa al-fa'iliyah, end quote. Two things can be noted here. Firstly, for Ibn Sina, causation is not designated to the cosmological setting, as even a triangle needs to be caused through abstraction or causative configuration, i.e., putting three lines together. Secondly, mathematical concepts do not seem to be necessary in their existence. With this metaphysical conceptualization in place, Ibn Sina then argues that, quote, if the cause was the first cause, then it is a cause for all of existence, end quote. In this way, it could be concluded that Ibn Sina has already made a full ontological argument. Subsequent arguments made in Al-Ish'arat should be read as having features of linking togetherness on the one hand, as well as characteristic stand-aloneness on the other. Up to this point, it is philosophically justified for us to conclude that Ibn Sina's argument is not cosmological in that it requires as much reference to the cosmos as a triangle does. His argument is also completely ontological in that it requires only abstraction of the mind. Bearing this in mind, it is therefore conceivable to have a cause and effect, illa and malul, without any reference whatsoever to the world of ma'ada, substance, or tabiya, material. More substantially, it is possible to make an Avicennian argument for a necessary existence without reference to cause and effect. However, Ibn Sina does transition to causality and says that, quote, if the causative agency is a first cause, then it is the cause of everything, end quote. He divides existence as either possible, mumkin, or dependent on other than itself to exist, and necessary, not dependent on anything to exist. Ibn Sina then reasons that there can only be one necessary existence. It is from this point onward that Ibn Sina entangles cosmology with ontology. Thomas Mayer points out that, quote, it will become clear that this crucial first phasel of the argument has stubbornly ontological traits, contradicting those who, like Davidson, deny any such element in the proof, end quote. Herbert Davidson, in his seminal work on Jewish and Islamic Kalam, does not see it this way. Avicenna does not regard the analysis of the concept of necessary existent by virtue of itself as sufficient to establish the actual existence of anything in the external world. He does not, in other words, wish to offer a priori or ontological proof for God's existence, but rather a new form of cosmological proof. End quote. Davidson further discusses, quote, Ibn Sina, without quite realizing it, developed a cosmological proof that can dispense with the impossibility of an infinite regress. End quote. Aside from sidestepping the major philosophical debate on the nature and possibility of infinite regress, which Ibn Sina himself rejects, Davidson designates Ibn Sina's conception of existence and causation as belonging only in the material world. Ibn Sina makes a cosmological argument by mentioning the example of movement in the sky and its connection with the will. He references time, movement, and power. But the question is not whether his argument can be seen to have cosmological elements, but whether they can be read as sufficient without reference to the cosmos. Another important question relates to the first principles that Ibn Sina uses to build his philosophy, upon which, as we have seen, these principles are characteristically metaphysical and ontological. Ibn Sina's dualism does not prohibit him from being able to interweave otherwise purely cosmological arguments into theoretical abstractions, and vice versa. Like Kant, many thinkers throughout history saw the problem in actualizing the abstract, instead preferring purely cosmological conceptions. A cursory examination of popular medieval cosmological arguments facilitates an even more sharply demarcated reading of Ibn Sina's philosophy relative to such arguments. For example, Maimonides, who prefers an Aristotelian type of argumentation that depends on time and motion, still uses the language of the Avicennian argument. In A Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides starts with the first cosmological principles referring to change, strength, movement, and time. Al-Ghazali also discusses a straightforward cosmological syllogism in Al-Iqtisad fi al-I'tiqad, saying, quote, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The world, alam, began to exist, therefore the world has a cause, end quote. Thomas Aquinas also argues using creation in his first principles in all of his arguments for the existence of God. The example of Maimonides, Al-Ghazali, and Aquinas are some of the many medieval examples of how contingency arguments can easily take a cosmological form. In other words, there is no attempt in these examples to deal with the metaphysical, as it may be assumed that these are ideal rather than real, in the way Kant may have suggested. Much like Kant, the Ash'aris, specifically Al-Juwayni, Al-Baqillani, and Al-Ghazali, made the distinction between the external, real, and the mental, ontological. Fascinatingly, they attempted to bridge the gap using the theory of particularization, takhsis, expounded at length by Al-Baqillani. In his Tamhid, Al-Baqillani uses the Aristotelian prime mover argument to discuss contingent things in the real world. When discussing animal forms, Al-Baqillani writes that if contingent real-world objects had a reason to be a certain way rather than another, then that reason must have been either inherent or external. In other words, contingent realities in the real world could be in any other way, and the fact that they have a particular form could be explained either contingently or necessarily. If we consider that it is necessary, then there must have been an external particularizer since, in Baqillani's reasoning, everything with the same properties would emerge all at once. This reasoning by Al-Baqillani fits in with the occasionalism that Ash'aris believe in, and attempts to create a bridge between the ontological and the cosmological. Commenting on this reasoning and on Al-Ghazali's response to Avicenna, Ayman Shihadeh writes, quote, Al-Ghazali's objection, however, rests on two assumptions. First, that Avicenna has only one rather simple account of possibility. Second, that possibility is either in the external world or in the mind. Avicenna sees no mutual contradiction between the notion that possibility is, on one respect, a mental judgment, and his assertion that the possibility of things that come to be present in a substrate, end quote. From this perspective, it is clear that there is a tension between the first principle assumptions of Ibn Sina and that of his medieval Kalam counterparts. This is because where they found a need to bridge the ontological to the cosmological using notions such as the theory of particularization, Ibn Sina did not see such a need. Ibn Sina seemed aware that a completely cosmological conception could have inductive limitations, preempting Hume. He therefore starts with a premise of mere existence, foreshadowing Descartes. Ibn Sina's famous declaration of, quote, there is no doubt there is existence, end quote, bypasses the Cartesian presupposition of self-awareness in I think, therefore I am, therefore also bypassing the Nietzschean criticisms of the cogito. It is from this point that Ibn Sina proceeds to dividing existence into necessary and contingent, almost as if there is no evidence to suggest the philosophical illegitimacy in doing otherwise. There is no Platonic world of forms that Ibn Sina refers to. He simply conflates existence acquired through sense datum with that done so through abstraction. In this regard, Mayer says, quote, "Next in the Fazl, existence is mentally subjected to a dichotomy. Either it is necessary or it is not necessary. On the basis of the first division, Ibn Sina immediately proceeds to infer the actual extra-mental reality of God. Ibn Sina says that the first division will amount to God, al-Haq, the necessarily existent in itself, and al-Qayyum, the self-subsistent. In this, Ibn Sina makes the crucial ontological move from the idea of a necessary division in the dichotomy of existence, expressed by the technical term wajib al-wujud, to the affirmation of a particular instance of it in reality, a divinity expressed by the scriptural terms al-Haq and al-Qayyum." End quote. The question of ontology is an interesting one that can be envisaged either a purely ontological argument or a synthesis between ontology and cosmology. If there can be no logical reason that dictates that a priori propositions are as real as empirical ones, there is no philosophical justification to give more epistemic weight to one proposition over the other. Parvis Morwedge disagrees with this, taking the Kantian view that ontological arguments are not satisfactory after designating Ibn Sina's argumentation to pure ontology. However, this in itself is an unsatisfactory conclusion, as it does not properly regard the aspects of Ibn Sina's argumentation, which have been discussed above as clearly cosmological in nature. For example, Ibn Sina's discussion on motion and planetary orbit could be invoked as evidence. Ibn Sina's preference of an ontological argument in the first instance, namely the cosmological argument of motion mentioned by Aristotle, does not mean that he rejected such arguments. However, Ibn Sina did not see these arguments as foundational. As John McGuinness notes, quote, "While Avicenna was convinced that physics could demonstrate that there was some first unmoved mover, he did not think one was justified in justifying this cause with God. At best, this entity is the cause of motion in our cosmos, but not the very existence of the cosmos itself. In contrast, God is the very cause of all existence itself." End quote. Mayer puts forth a similar point to this, quote, "The complete argument can now be evaluated. Morwedge and Davidson are both correct in that the proof as a whole is simultaneously ontological and cosmological. Ibn Sina initially divides existence into the necessary and the contingent. Then, the necessary must be affirmed to exist unconditionally. This is an ontological train of reasoning." End quote. However, where Mayer is accurate in understanding Ibn Sina's argument as synthetic, he is less accurate in his saying of the contingent only existent by another. This means that while it may comprise an infinity of individuals, it cannot be self-sufficient. This follows a cosmological train of reasoning. Mayer might have been on safer ground had he cited one of many examples where causality or contingency are applied to aspects of the cosmos itself, since infinity itself is a concept that could be said to exist only in abstraction. If one concludes, as Kant has in our introduction, that establishing the existence of something should be done empirically, there is a hidden naturalistic presupposition. The problem with Kant's interrogation is that it is circular. It assumes that a methodological physicalism should be presupposed in the study of something that may be proved, in subsequent discursive rationalization, to be metaphysical. It could be argued that this is equivalent to attempting to detect mathematics through scientific experimentation. These forms of interrogation, together with other types, were central to the debate between positivists and other philosophers in the early 20th century. This debate rendered both positivism and verificationism as less credible, which was ultimately reflected in the Popperian shift to the falsificationism in the philosophy of science. In philosophical hindsight, these debates are critical to our conceptions of cosmological arguments and their relationship with ontological ones. Would dualists like Ibn Sina consider sensory existence as more factual than metaphysical existence? Does the Kantian tripartite typology presuppose a methodological naturalism that renders ontological arguments, as Morwedge would concur, as unreal part of existence? Is the proposition of an unreal existence possible in the first place? The answers to these questions all depend on one's epistemological expectation. Perhaps what Ibn Sina did, which was truly innovative, was filling the gap in the philosophical market for metaphysical explanations that would appeal to the dualists and idealists as much as it would to physicalists. In his effort to leave no epistemological stone unturned, Ibn Sina premised his entire argument on ontological first principles before proceeding to mention things that are specific to the cosmos as additional evidence. Returning to Kant's original complaint, it would seem that Ibn Sina anticipated his objections. He attempted to offer evidences that would satisfy the mind's curiosity as well as the empiricist's inquiry of sense datum. For Ibn Sina, the necessary being which depends on no one or nothing for its existence, and yet everything depends on it for its own, is equivalent to a mathematical equation which is already actualized in the workings of the cosmos through physics.